It was a doctrine, a faith. It was conceived in the Alabama war colleges of the 1932nd by thinkers like General Haywood Hansell. It was forged by a tough, quiet man named Ira C. Eaker. The doctrine was daylight precision bombing. It was a revolutionary and very American idea. The British, under Bomber Harris, had embraced the brutal reality of the dark. They believed the only way to hit Germany was with nighttime area bombing, leveling cities, killing civilians. It was industrial terror. Eaker and the American 8th Air Force believed there was a better way, a surgical way. They believed the war could be won by destroying specific bottlenecks in the German war machine, not the whole city. A single ball-bearing factory, a single tire plant, a single U-boat pen, and they would do it in broad daylight, using the most precise tool ever created. The Norden bomb sight, a secret mechanical computer, allegedly capable of putting a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. To do this, they had an airplane, the Boeing B-17. The Flying Fortress. It was a magnificent name. It promised safety. It promised power. 13. 50 caliber machine guns, arranged for 360-degree fields of fire. The doctrine said that a combat box of hundreds of B-17 seconds, with the interlocking fire of 1,000 machine guns, would be a self-defending fortress. It could fly into Germany in broad daylight, without fighter escort, defend itself, and destroy the target. It was a beautiful, logical, arrogant belief. And it was lethally wrong. Faith could not armor aluminum. By the autumn of 1943, that faith was being shattered over Germany. The crews knew the truth. The Flying Fortress was not a fortress, it was bait. And the cost was measured in the empty bunks at bases like RAF Thorpe Abbotts. In Germany, the man responsible for tearing that doctrine apart was General Adolf Galland. Galland was a legendary ace, a professional soldier who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter force. He was not a fanatic, he was a hunter, and he had found the B-17's fatal flaw. It was called the 12 o'clock high. Galland realized that attacking a B-17 from the rear or the side was suicide. The waist and tail gunners would shred you. But from the front, the B-17 pilots and co-pilots had only fixed, slow-firing machine guns. It was a blind spot. Galland ordered his FAR 190 and Messerschmitt 109 squadrons. Fly above the bomber stream, 5 miles out. Then turn, line up, and attack head-on. Dive from 12 o'clock high. Aim for the cockpit. It was a 600-mile-per-hour game of chicken. The German pilots had about 3 seconds to fire their 20mm cannons into the B-17's cockpit before they had to peel away to avoid a collision. It was a brutal, nerve-shattering tactic. And it was working. It was killing the 8th Air Force. In August 1943, General Eaker decided to gamble everything. He had to prove his doctrine worked. He targeted the single most important objective in Germany, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. Without ball bearings, no tanks, no planes, no engines could be built. It was the Nazi Achilles heel. On August 17th, Eaker sent 376 bombers to Schweinfurt and Regensburg. It was a catastrophe. They lost 60 planes, 600 men. The factories were damaged, but not destroyed. Now, it was October 1943. The factories were repaired. Eaker had to go back. He had to finish the job. He knew the cost. So did his crews. This would be Mission 115. At RAF Thorpe Abbotts, the 100th Bomb Group, the bloody 100th, prepared. They were the unluckiest group, with the highest loss rate. They were used to the empty bunks. Among their crews was a 24-year-old pilot from Brooklyn, First Lieutenant Robert Rosie Rosenthal. Rosie was different. He was a graduate of Brooklyn Law School. He had enlisted for one simple reason. He hated the Nazis. He was the pilot of the B-17 Royal Flush. This was his third mission. He was still new. He still believed. He would fly with 9 other men, his crew, into the center of the storm. 4. October 14th, 1943. the Nissan briefing hut, the air thick with burnt coffee and fear. Rosie sat with his crew. The intelligence officer pulled the curtain from the map. A collective, muffled groan. The red ribbon stretched to the same place. Schweinfurt. Again, everyone in the room knew what had happened in August. They knew their P-47 Thunderbolt escort, their little friends, would have to turn back at the Belgian border, out of fuel. They knew they would have to fly hundreds of miles, alone, through Gallen's fighter belt, to the target, and back. It was a suicide mission. Rosie looked at his crew. They were so young. He was a lawyer. He knew the odds. And the odds said they were not coming back. 6. The dawn was a sick grey smear on the wet runway of Thorpe Abbots. A green flare hissed up from the control tower. That was the signal. The roaring began. First 1 engine. Then 10. Then 100. Across East Anglia, 4,000 Wright Cyclone engines bellowed, shaking the countryside. Robert Rosenthal sat in the left-hand pilot's seat of the Royal Flush. He checked his gauges. Oil. Fuel. Hydraulics. He was a lawyer. He believed in the details. Beside him, his co-pilot, Ron Bailey, began the checklist. Batteries. On. Instruments. Checked. Fuel pumps. On. Bailey's voice was a monotone, a programmed calm. Rosenthal released the brakes. The 32-ton B-17, full of 10,000 pounds of bombs and 2,700 gallons of fuel, began to waddle. It was like taxiing a building. They lined up, a long row of metal monsters, nose to tail in the grey light. 30 seconds apart, the plane in front of them roared and began to run. It never seemed to lift. It ran, and ran, and ran. And then, at the last second, a small gap appeared under its wheels. It was airborne. "We're up," Rosenthal said. He pushed all 4 throttles forward. The acceleration slammed them into their seats. The runway rushed at them. 100 knots! Bailey yelled. 120! End of the runway, Rosie. I've got it. Rosenthal pulled back on the yoke. With a groan, the main wheels lifted off the concrete. The Royal Flush was flying, 1 airborne, hundreds more to go. Now began the chaotic ballet. The assembly, hundreds of B-17 seconds, taking off from 20 different airfields, all trying to find each other in the thick English clouds, in the dark, to form their perfect combat boxes. It was a nightmare. Rosenthal flew by his squadron's radio beacon. He climbed to 10,000 feet, then began a wide, slow turn. He was looking for his flare. The 100th was red, green. "Got it, 9 o'clock," the waist gunner shouted. "Roger, moving in." Rosenthal began to ease the Royal Flush into her slot. He had to fly 50 feet from the B-17 to his right, 50 feet from the one in front. One mistake, one gust of wind, and 180 men in his squadron would die in a colliding fireball. This was Rosie's 3rd mission. His first, to Münster, had been just as bad. The 100th Bomb Group had lost 12 of its 13 planes. Only Rosenthal's Royal Flush had returned. It came back, riddled with holes, 2 engines out, 1 waist gunner wounded. The 100th called him Rosie the Invulnerable. Rosenthal hated the name. It wasn't skill, it was dumb luck, and he knew luck ran out. They circled for an hour. Climbing, 15,000 feet. "Oxygen masks on," Rosenthal ordered. The cold hit. Rosenthal's breath frosted on his oxygen mask, 20,000 feet. Inside, the air was as thin and cold as it was outside. The first enemy was not German. It was anoxia. If a man's mask came loose, he had 30 seconds before he passed out, a few minutes before brain death. It was a silent death. At 25,000 feet, they joined the bomber stream. Rosenthal looked out. The sight was magnificent. A river of steel in the sky, miles wide. Hundreds of fortresses, glinting in the sun, stacked in perfect combat boxes. A geometric masterpiece of destruction. It was beautiful. It was the embodiment of Ika's doctrine, a self-defending fortress. It looked unstoppable. They crossed the English Channel. The water, a deep, glittering blue below. Rosenthal's navigator, Second Lieutenant Ronald F. Stella, came over the intercom. Cross the departure point, Rosie, over the Dutch coast. We're in. Instantly there was a change. The sky above them came alive. Escorts here, 11 o'clock high. Rosenthal saw them. The P-47 Thunderbolts, their little friends. Fat, powerful, escort fighters. They weaved and dove, arrogant, like sheepdogs guarding the flock. Rosenthal let out a breath. They were not alone. He could hear the joking chatter of the fighter pilots on the radio. They were cocky, confident. They were the only ones in the sky who actually wanted a fight. They flew deeper into Europe. The land was a green and brown patchwork. Everything was peaceful. Just the steady, hypnotic drone of hundreds of engines, the lull before the storm. Rosenthal checked his watch. 40 minutes since they met the P-47 seconds. Target was 90 minutes out. He glanced at his fuel gauge. He knew what was coming. Over the command net, a voice came, chillingly calm. Thunderbolt lead to bomber lead. We are at bingo fuel. We have to turn 'em back. The group colonel's voice in the lead bomber replied, Roger, Thunderbolt. Thanks for the ride. See you at the pub, boys. Tally-ho. Rosenthal looked to his left. He saw the lead P-47. The pilot gave a salute. Then, as one, the P-47 seconds peeled off, diving away, back to England. They were out of gas. Their little friends were gone. And then, the silence. An absolute, deafening silence on the radio. They were alone. Over 300 B-17 bombers, flying by themselves, into the heart of the Reich. Rosenthal checked his formation. Keep it tight, boys. The navigator, Stella, looked down at his map. Coming up on it, he whispered. Coming up on what? The tail gunner asked. The flak belt. The Ruhr Valley. Robert Rosenthal, the lawyer from Brooklyn, gripped the yoke. The doctrine of the self-defending fortress was about to be tested. It didn't start with a sound. It started with an image. Below them, the ground seemed to twinkle. Hundreds of tiny orange pinpricks, like camera flashes, winking in the industrial haze of the Ruhr. Lieutenant Stella, the navigator, saw them first through the nose glass. He swallowed. All right, crew. Robert Rosenthal's voice came over the intercom, straining for calm. This is it. Flak zone. Check your flak vests. Hold formation. A few seconds passed. A tense, stretched silence. Then, hell arrived. They were not fireworks. They were small, dirty black clouds, puffs of death. They appeared from thin air, right outside the window, at 25,000 feet. Puff, puff, puff. They blossomed, silently. Then the sound hit. It was not an explosion. It was a heavy, jarring crump, as if a giant were hitting the fuselage with a sledgehammer. Crump. The royal flush was thrown 50 feet up, then dropped. Inside, 50 caliber shell casings rattled on the floor. Flak. Heavy. 6 o'clock low, the tail gunner shouted. It's everywhere. Rosenthal and his co-pilot, Bailey, were fighting the yoke. The plane, like a speared whale, was trying to flip over. Hold her, Ron. I'm trying. The updraft is uneven. They could not evade. That was Ira Ika's iron rule. To evade was to break the combat box. To break the box was to die. A lone B-17 was a dead B-17. They had to fly straight. They had to trust the doctrine and fly right through it. The German flak gunners, sitting in massive concrete towers, were masters. They had calculated the formation's altitude, wind speed, and airspeed. They weren't aiming at the royal flush. They were aiming at a box in the sky. A box of space, 3 miles long, 2 miles wide, and 1 mile high, and the entire combat wing was flying right into it. Crump whoomp. A larger explosion. Closer. The B-17 to their right, the Alice from Dallas, shuddered violently. Rosenthal saw it. A flak shell had torn apart its number 2 engine. The plane began to fall behind. It wasn't dead, but it was wounded. It was losing speed. "Hold formation!" Rosenthal yelled. The Alice tried, but it slowly drifted out of the box's protection. It had become a lagger, a death sentence. They had been in the flak for 8 minutes. It felt like 8 years. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. They were through. The silence was deafening, just the steady 4-engine drone. "Damage report," Rosenthal ordered. "Gauges are green, Rosie. We're lucky," Bailey said. They were. The Alice from Dallas was not. It was flying a mile behind them, losing altitude. And now, the real enemy appeared. On the ground, General Adolf Galland had been watching them. He knew they were coming. He knew where they were going. Schweinfurt. He didn't care about flak. Flak was a nuisance. Galland's tactic was fighters. He had held his 4-190 and Messerschmitt 109 squadrons back, waiting for the American P-47 seconds to turn around. And now, bandits. The voice from the top turret gunner was sharp as ice. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Rosenthal squinted. At first, they were just black dots, like flies. But they were growing, very fast. "My God," Bailey whispered. "How many?" "Counting 20. "No, 30, the top gunner reported, his voice flat. "They're lining up." It was the 12 o'clock high attack. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned to attack head-on. They would fly high, 5 miles out. They would line up, in waves, like cavalry. Then, they would dive, straight through the formation, at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour. They had about 3 seconds to fire. They aimed for the cockpit. "Here they come!" Rosenthal yelled. The sky exploded. The first 12 W-190 seconds ripped through the formation like cannonballs. The Royal Flushes, 50 caliber guns roared, joining the chorus of hundreds of others. Golden tracers filled the sky, a hopeless web of fire. An FW-190 dove straight at Rosenthal. He could see the pilot's face. Rosenthal did not flinch. He flew straight. The 4-190 fired. 20mm cannon shells flashed past the windscreen. THUD, THUD, THUD. They slammed into the fuselage. The fighter peeled off, diving so close it almost clipped Rosenthal's wing. He's through, but that was just the first wave. Second wave. 1 o'clock high. This time, Messerschmitts. They were firing Werfer-Granate 21 rockets. White smoke trails streamed past. They weren't accurate. They didn't need to be. They were designed to explode in the formation, to break it apart. A rocket exploded 100 feet off Rosenthal's left wing. The shockwave slammed the Royal Flush. "Hold formation!" Rosenthal roared, fighting the yoke. That's what they want. But a B-17 inches the lower squadron, big stoop, took a direct hit. It didn't explode. It simply stopped, as if it hit an invisible wall. It fell out of the formation, on fire, straight down. The ball turret gunner screamed, "Shoots! Shoots! 3! No. 4 shoots. Not 10. 4. Now it was a massacre. The German fighters began picking off the stragglers. They wheeled around and swarmed the Alice from Dallas. Rosenthal and his crew had to watch, helplessly. They saw the 20mm tracers tear the B-17 apart. They saw it catch fire, from tail to nose. They saw its wing fold. No shoots. 10 more men. Gone. The flying fortress doctrine was a lie. The 50 caliber guns were useless against a head-on attack. The combat box was not a fortress. It was a trap. It just held the planes together, making a bigger, easier target for the German pilots. This was not a battle. It was a running fight. They were still 40 minutes from Schweinfurt, 40 minutes of hell. Those 40 minutes were not a flight. They were an organized retreat. The Luftwaffe pilots knew the combat box was an illusion. Once hit, it dissolved. The sky was now a chaos of smoke trails, parachutes, and falling metal. The fighter squadrons, having rearmed and refueled, returned. They were directed by Adolf Galland. Finish the stragglers, then attack the leaders. Robert Rosenthal's Royal Flush was still flying. They had been lucky. The THUDs against their fuselage were just small flak fragments or 13mm machine gun rounds, no direct 20mm cannon hits. But they were flying next to an empty space. Alice from Dallas was gone, leaving a deadly hole in the formation. "Hold tight," Rosenthal repeated like a mantra. He was trying to nudge his plane closer to the squadron leader, to fill the gap. Below them, the ground was no longer a patchwork. It was Schweinfurt. "I see the target!" "Stella," the navigator yelled. 4 minutes! "All right," Rosenthal said, beginning bomb run. This was the worst moment of any mission. They had to fly straight and level. No evading, no changing altitude. They had to hold the B-17 steady for 4 minutes, so the bombardier could lock the Norden bomb site. That was 4 minutes as a sitting duck. And the flak came up. This time, it was not random black clouds. It was a solid black wall. The 88mm and 105mm guns protecting Schweinfurt were the densest in Europe. They opened fire. Crump, 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 crump. The Royal Flush was thrown up and down. "Hold it!" Rosenthal roared, sweat pouring down his forehead, freezing instantly. He had to keep the Norden's crosshairs steady. 1 minute, the bombardier yelled. Crump! A hot piece of shrapnel tore through the windscreen, missed Bailey's head by inches, and embedded itself in the bulkhead behind Rosenthal. Bailey didn't even blink. 30 seconds. Outside, Rosenthal saw another B-17, lazy baby, take a direct hit. It vaporized. No shoots. They were over the target. Bomb bay doors open. Target locked. Bombs. Away. The plane leaped upward, 10,000 pounds lighter. Bomb bay doors closing. "Let's get out of here, Rosie," Stella yelled. Rosenthal banked the B-17 hard, a violent turn to get out of the flak. Below, the ball-bearing plants vanished in a cloud of fire and smoke. They had done it. They had hit the target. They had completed the mission. But now, they had to go home. 400 miles. Alone. The brutal truth of the deep raids was not the flight to the target. It was the flight back. The German fighter squadrons, knowing their exact route, had landed, refueled, rearmed, and taken off again. They were waiting. And this time, it wasn't just for 190 seconds. It was everything. BF 110 seconds. Me 210 seconds. Jew 88 seconds. Heavy, twin-engine destroyers, armed with 30mm cannons and rockets. Too slow to fight a P-51, but perfect for killing a lumbering B-17. Adolf Galland had unleashed the finishers. Bandits! 9 o'clock. They came, not from the front, but from the sides and rear. The 12 o'clock high attack had done its job of breaking the formation. Now it was time to kill the wounded. A Bf 110 flew parallel to the Royal Flush, out of 50 caliber range, and launched a rocket. It streaked past the tail, exploding behind them. "My God, they're firing rockets at us," the waist gunner yelled. A B-17 inches the squadron above, hit by a rocket, began to burn. Then another. The formation, already loose, disintegrated. There was no combat box, no self-defending fortress. It was now 300 individual planes, desperately racing for home, and the sky was full of sharks. Rosenthal's Royal Flush was hit. An FW 190 attacked from 6 o'clock. Rosenthal's tail gunner fired, hitting it. "I got him, he's smoking," but another one came in from 5 o'clock. 20mm cannon shells tore through the rear fuselage. Left waist gunner's hit. "He's hit bad." Radio room's on fire. A small, oily fire began to burn near the radio operator. Rosenthal looked at his panel. He had lost engine. Number 2. Feather, number 2. Ron, get the fire. They were on 3 engines. Now they were a lagger. and the German fighters smelled blood. 2 Messerschmitts dove in. They aimed for the cockpit. Shells ripped through the nose glass, shattering the instruments. Stella, the navigator, was hit in the leg. "Ah, I'm hit. Hold on, Stella. We're almost out of it," Rosenthal yelled. But he knew they weren't. The fire in the radio room was spreading. If it hit the oxygen lines, they would vaporize. "Ron," Rosenthal said to his co-pilot, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You and the radio man, get that fire. Use the extinguishers." "Now." Bailey nodded. He unplugged his oxygen, clipped on a walk-around bottle, and scrambled out of the cockpit. Rosenthal was now flying the B-17 alone, on 3 engines, with a fire on board, and with 2 more fighters attacking him. The top turret gunner screamed, "They're coming in! 4 o'clock!" Rosenthal could do nothing. He just had to fly straight. He heard the THUD, THUD, THUD as more cannon shells slammed the plane. Engine number 1 died. They were down to 2 engines, both on the right wing. The plane began to bank violently to the left. It couldn't fly. It was falling. "We're spinning! We're spinning!" The ball turret gunner screamed. Rosenthal used all his strength, jamming his right rudder pedal to the floor, trying to stop the spiral. It wasn't working. "Bailey, get back here!" he yelled. Ron Bailey, his face black with soot, scrambled back into the co-pilot's seat. The fire was out. "Help me!" Rosenthal roared. Both men, together, stood on the right rudder pedal, the B-17 slowly, leveled out. They had stopped the spin. But they were flying on only 2 engines, and they were falling 1,000 feet a minute. "We're not going to make it," Bailey said, his voice hopeless. "We're at 18,000. 17,000. "Bail out," Rosenthal ordered. He hit the alarm bell. No one moved. They knew what was happening outside. If they bailed out now, they would be shot in their parachutes by the Luftwaffe. I said, "Bail out." No one moved, Rosenthal realized. They would rather die with the ship than be murdered while helpless. He looked down. 10,000 feet. Light flak began to come up. They were too low. And then? A miracle. The German fighters. They were gone. They had turned back. They were out of fuel. They were alone. A crippled B-17, on 2 engines, 8,000 feet off the ground, deep in enemy territory. "Stella," Rosenthal said, his voice a rasp. "Get us home." Robert Rosenthal was flying a dead airplane. It was flying, but it shouldn't have been. The Royal Flush had only 2 engines, both on the right wing. The asymmetrical thrust was trying to flip the B-17 on its back. Rosenthal and his co-pilot, Ron Bailey, had to use their combined strength, jamming the right rudder pedal to the floor, just to keep the plane flying straight. They were at 8,000 feet. They had lost 10,000 feet in minutes. They were deep in enemy territory. "Stella, how are you?" Rosenthal yelled to the navigator. "I'm hit, my leg!" Stella yelled back. The nose glass was shattered. Left waist gunner? Silence. He was dead, torn apart by 20mm cannon fire. Radio room? The radio operator had put out the fire, but he was badly burned. The Royal Flush was a flying abattoir, but it was still flying. They flew alone. For 2 hours. The 2 longest hours of Rosenthal's life. Every second he expected another FW-190 to appear, but there was nothing, just the shriek of wind through the holes in the fuselage and the out-of-sync roar of the 2 remaining engines. They flew over the Dutch flak belt, too low to be detected. They crossed the English Channel. "Rosie," Bailey whispered. "I see it. The coast of England." They had made it. "Can't make Thorpe Abbots," Rosenthal said. "We won't get that far. Find me the nearest airfield." "Any airfield." They spotted an RAF base. "Fire the red flares," Rosenthal ordered. The signal for a badly wounded aircraft. They began their approach. "Landing gear," Rosenthal called. It's dead, Rosie. Hydraulics are gone. No landing gear. All right, Rosenthal said, his voice calm. Prepare for a belly landing. He ordered the surviving crew, except the co-pilot, to brace in the radio room, the safest position. He lined the royal flush up with the grass strip. Slowly, slowly. He cut the power. The belly of the B-17 touched the grass. A terrible shriek of metal tearing earth. Mud flew everywhere. The plane skidded for hundreds of yards, tearing up the field, before coming to a stop with a final metal groan. Silence. Then someone yelled, "Get out! Get out! It could blow!" Rosenthal and Bailey scrambled out of the cockpit. They fell onto the ground. Robert Rosenthal, the lawyer from Brooklyn, was on English grass. He looked back. His royal flush, the plane that had brought them home, was broken in two, but it had brought them home. Of the 13 planes from the 100th bomb group on the previous Munster raid, only the royal flush had returned. Of the 17 planes from the 100th bomb group on today's Schweinfurt raid, only the royal flush had completed the mission, hit the target, and returned to England. Robert Rosenthal had survived. That night, at the bases of the 8th Air Force, intelligence officers counted the cost. They called it Black Thursday, the 14th of October 1943. The 8th Air Force had lost 60 B-17 bombers, 600 men, killed or captured. In one day. And for what? The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were damaged, but not destroyed. They were repaired and back in operation within 6 weeks. General Ira Eaker had bet everything on his doctrine. And he had lost. The doctrine was dead. The self-defending flying fortress was a myth. It was an aluminum coffin. The 8th Air Force ceased all deep, unescorted raids into Germany for almost 5 months. They had been defeated. They had lost the air war. But the story does not end there. It does not end with empty bunks at Thorpe Abbotts, because that brutal, terrible sacrifice was necessary. That failure forced Washington to confront a truth it had ignored. If the fortress could not defend itself, something else would have to. And from the ashes of Black Thursday rose the winning weapon of 1944, the North American P-51 Mustang. It was not born a savior. It was a mediocre, rejected design, until a British engineer had a stroke of genius. He combined the P-51's airframe with the greatest engine in the world, the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. The result was a miracle. A fighter with speed, altitude, and agility, and most importantly, range. With drop tanks, the P-51 Mustang could fly from England to Berlin and back. The little friends could now go all the way. Spring 1944. When the B-17 seconds returned to the skies over Germany, they were not alone. They were encased in hundreds, then thousands, of Mustangs. When General Galland and his W-190 pilots rose to attack the fat cows, they found themselves set upon by silver sharks. The sky was no longer the Luftwaffe's sanctuary. It was their arena. And this is the real legacy. This is the brutal truth of the air war. The B-17 seconds were not a sword. They were an anvil. The 8th Air Force did not send Robert Rosenthal to Germany just to destroy factories. They sent him there as bait. The real target of the 1944 air war was not Schweinfurt. The target was the Luftwaffe. The B-17 seconds flew into Germany as a challenge, forcing the foe 190 seconds and Messerschmitts to come up. And when they came up, the P-51 seconds, the hammer, destroyed them. They ground the German Air Force to dust against the B-17 Anvil. They swept the skies of Europe clear of German fighters. They won total air superiority. They made D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, possible, because when the Allies landed on the beaches in June 1944, there was not a single German plane in the sky to bomb them. They had already been destroyed by the escorts of the Royal Flush. The 8th Air Force paid an unimaginable price. They suffered 26,000 dead, more than the entire United States Marine Corps in World War II. They began with young men who believed in a myth. They ended by winning a war with brutal, cold arithmetic. Robert Rosenthal, the lawyer, kept flying. He flew 52 missions in total. He survived. But he had flown through hell on an aluminum anvil so that the P-51 hammer could fall. And at Thorpe Abbott's, at hundreds of bases across England, the empty bunks were the proof of the price of the sky.